who will be South Africa's next Chief Justice as the tenure of Chief Justice Mogoeng comes to an end next year? A debate is already raging about who should occupy that important role. Judicial watchdog Judge Matters says it's now time to reflect on the gender composition of the judiciary and consider a woman for that post. The call has been echoed by ANC Deputy General, Secretary General, Jessie Duarte. Given the long history of the marginalization of women in the legal profession, one view is that the appointment of a woman carries enormous symbolic importance. For more on this, let's bring in Professor Helene Combrink, who's an Associate Professor at the University of the Northwest Faculty of Law. Prof, thanks very much for your time and welcome to the AM Report. To me, it feels a bit awkward asking, should a woman be the next Chief Justice? A bit of an outdated question, in my opinion. Do you think perhaps it might be worthwhile reflecting on whether or not there is enough political will to see a woman occupying this post?
You know, when I first heard about this debate that has started about whether a woman will take the position, my own reaction was also, really? Are we still thinking in those terms? But I think we have to be realistic. Women have been historically marginalized in South Africa generally, and specifically during the apartheid years. We have to bear in mind that all of those years there was only ever one woman judge. She was a formidable woman, but I think that immediately shows us how the demographics are historically skewed. So I think just from that perspective, I think it's important to recognize that we've made a lot of progress. If you just look at the increase in numbers in women judges in senior positions, I think it's very clear that we've moved beyond the situation where people ask, you know, should a woman really be a judge? Because isn't she going to be too sensitive if she has to sentence a criminal accused, for example? Well, I certainly hope we're beyond that. Yeah. But I do think that the question needs to be asked because yesterday I started looking at some statistics and I was surprised to see that when you look, for example, at the judges president, you can say the head judge in every province, there are very few women there. Judge Monica Liu, for example, here in the Northwest, and you know, it's clearly not really balanced. So I agree with you reluctantly that it is still a question we need to ask, and I certainly think that it's something we need to bear in mind, specifically in light of the Constitution.
It certainly brings up an important issue and perhaps an important critical discussion. The framing perhaps might leave a lot to be desired, but you know, outside of the optics, right, what things look like, there has to be more significance in having a woman if in fact a woman is appointed as the Chief Justice. Take us through, at least even symbolically, what this would mean, not only for the profession but certainly for the role of Chief Justice too.
Well, I think, let's start with the profession. I think it's incredibly important from the symbolic perspective for young women lawyers when they graduate to see that it is possible, it can be done, because we have to bear in mind that, you know, the legal profession is traditionally quite conservative, and as in most other professions, women still to a large extent have to do more and have to work harder to get to the same positions. It's very interesting, if you look at the statistics at universities, there are more women who graduate, more law graduates, and more women who go into practice. Not vastly more, but and generally those women do better at university. But then once they're in practice and you start looking at the senior positions, the directorships in attorneys' firms, it seems that the women are falling out. And the reason for that, well, it's very complicated, or very complex rather, but it's obviously linked to the fact that women are still the ones who have the babies and look after them. So I think from that perspective of saying that despite the fact that women might have a more difficult route, it is possible to actually reach these achievements.
Yeah.
Much in the same way as it is still really important to see Black advocates and attorneys and practitioners becoming judges, taking on senior positions, because I don't think we've shaken that particular aspect of our legacy either.
Right. And, Prof, one of the many potential unintended consequences of this conversation, as important as it is that if a woman is eventually appointed as the next Chief Justice, there might be perceptions that she's only there because she's a woman, and she's only there because this conversation preceded her appointment. How do we ensure that we push back against that perception at the very least? Because I imagine whoever's going to fill the role is very well deserving to be there despite their gender identity.
This is where we're actually very lucky, because we have a number of women candidates who are eminently well qualified to take the position. And especially because the Justice Service Commission interviews with potential judges are open to the public. They're usually available in video format, recordings, etc. It will be very easy for somebody who is concerned about that aspect to actually, be part of that process and make sure, to their own satisfaction, that the right candidate has been appointed. I think that in South Africa at the moment, there is that risk with any number of appointments that there might be the response, yes, he or she is only here because they are women, because they have a disability, whatever the case might be. But as I say, I don't think we really even have to move into that realm because of the fact that we have so many extremely well qualified potential applicants. I'm saying potential applicants because we don't yet know who is going to apply and who isn't.
Yeah, and that was going to actually be my next question. I mean, do we know if there's even an appetite amongst women in the profession to take up this role? From the outside, for us laymen, it certainly seems like a prestigious role, I beg your pardon, one that, anybody would work their career towards, but is it as appetizing from the inside, so to speak?
I think it very much depends on the individual, because, if you look at the Constitution, for example, the qualifications are not very specific. It's basically the same qualifications as for judges generally, which is that the person must be appropriately qualified, they must be a fit and proper person, and must be broadly representative in terms of race and gender of the South African population. And from there onward, we have to basically start looking at, at what this position means in practice. There's obviously a lot of staff management. There's a lot of logistics, much more than would be the case with a judge sitting in court, whose only function is limited to that. And I'm not saying that, that it's not a lot of work. But you're also looking at budget management, for example, for all the courts in South Africa, except the magistrate courts, and it's a combination of still being a judge, giving important judgments, because everybody looks to the Chief Justice when a judgment is being given. I would imagine that it's not unlikely that the Chief Justice, the next Chief Justice, would probably come from the senior the Supreme Court of Appeal or the Constitutional Court. And in other words, of its nature, the judgments given by that particular Chief Justice are already important because these are the two highest courts. But everybody scrutinizes the Chief Justice's judgments even a little bit more. If that makes sense.
It does.
So you want somebody who is a good legal scholar, somebody who's good with all of these managerial functions that I've referred to, and somebody who can really be almost in millennial terms an opinion leader. We recently saw with our present Justice Mogoeng and the problems around the comments around Palestine, that people look at what the Chief Justice says, even if it's not immediately related to the operation of the court.
Right, and that's exactly where I was hoping to go, Prof, if I can come in there, because one almost got a sense that perhaps what the Chief Justice did, even without intent, was also create a debate about whether or not there are reasonable expectations about the role of a Chief Justice and how the individual interacts with society. To what extent do you think that has changed? You know, the expectations we have of a Chief Justice, whether or not they're able to comment about things that are very closely related to them outside their capacity as Chief Justice, and how that feeds into who is then likely to be appointed next, because I'm sure it must.
You know, my sense is that there's been a lot of movement, a lot of opening up since the early years of democracy, because we inherited a legal tradition that is very proper and very stiff upper lip, and a judge should not even really be seen to have a private life, you know, in terms of those days. Whereas now, you know, if we see at the way in which retired judges interact with society, with human rights organizations, with students, I think that's extremely healthy. I think that's extremely good to give people an idea of how the courts work. It can become a perilous line, as I think our Chief Justice, our current Chief Justice, found out recently. Because the ultimate question, of course, is whether it can be said that the Chief Justice indicated some form of favor or prejudice in terms of cases that are yet to be heard. So it's not a question that, you know, all the doors have suddenly been flung open. And I'm also quite sure that there are probably a couple of conversations among judges themselves, very informally, of course, around where some of the boundaries lie. But you're right. I think especially in South Africa, where for a long time we kind of looked for leadership in unlikely places for various reasons. You know, the role of the Chief Justice as an opinion maker, as an influencer, cannot be underestimated.
Absolutely. Thanks very much for coming through, giving us some important things to think about as we look towards this process that I imagine will begin soon to try to find the next Chief Justice. Certainly appreciate your time on the AM Report. Professor Helene Combrink is a professor with the Law Faculty at Northwest University.